flag salute this morning will be led by our County Counsel, Tony LaBeouf.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Tony. Ann, would you read the meeting procedures, please?
Welcome to the Placer County Board of Supervisors meeting of Wednesday, August 19th, 2009. Agendas are available on the wall outside this meeting room. If you are here to speak on an issue not appearing on the agenda, you may do so during the public comment period. There's a 3-minute time limit per speaker. The board is not permitted to take action on items addressed under public comment. When you speak, clearly state your name and address for the record. All items on the agenda will be open for the public to address before final action is taken. There is a 3-minute time limit per speaker, which will be monitored by a timer on the podium. If there is a person speaking on behalf of a group with no other testimony from another member of the group, please identify yourself as such, and your time may be extended at the pleasure of the board. Keep in mind that the chairman has the discretion of limiting the total discussion time on any item. If you are hearing impaired, we have listening devices available. It is requested that all pagers and cell phones be either turned off or put in the silent mode. Thank you for your participation and cooperation.
Thank you, Ann. All right, I will now open it up to public comment. Anybody wishing to address the board on any items not on the agenda? Seeing none, I will close public comment. Any Supervisors Committee reports this morning? Do we need to send out an APB for Robert? That's right.
Was that you, Mr. Holmes? What? Animal control. For Robert. Maybe Chief McCord might know where monitoring the prices and tracking.
All right, we'll begin with...
Yeah, change the shirt.
He fed the cows before he came in?
To or from?
Can't reveal.
All right, we will start with the County Executive Budget Workshop. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for gracing us.
He does have a Tommy Bahama on.
Good call, Rocky.
Okay.
Not much.
Go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. I'll wait a moment while the slides come down. As the slideshow is coming down, though, just as a recap from yesterday's presentation, yesterday we presented a variety of information to you. We talked a lot about what we've seen historically over the past several years, the challenges that this county has faced, the information that we've provided you over the past several years in terms of budget challenges, the decline in the economy, the repeated times we visited with you showing you declines in revenues, the expenditure recommendations we've brought before your board. We've come to you with a number of recommendations over the past several years on how to address the declines in revenues, the things that we've seen come from the state, the ways the state has chosen to address its repeated revenue shortfalls in budget after budget. And we also brought before you yesterday the ways that the departments are addressing their shortfalls and how their proposed budgets are looking in the coming fiscal year. And today, we're going to be bringing some remaining budget issues and ways we look to address the 2009-10 budget. We're also going to present a multi-year budget projection for you. Therese Leonard's going to be bringing that before you. And then wrap up the budget presentation showing you how our operating funds would look in 2009-10, and then get closing direction from your board. So to go ahead and start, And this slide basically shows what I just ran through. Again, starting with the slide very similar to what you saw yesterday, the proposed budget showed the 361, almost $362 million general fund, with that carryover fund balance of about $24 million. And again, what we talked about yesterday of an increased carryover about $9.7 million. What we'll talk about a little more today is a cancellation of about an additional $1 million in HHS reserves, very limited increase in reserve usage in a limited area in HHS. Again, some additional areas we talked about yesterday in revenue declines, and we went over again. This is by way of review today because we talked about a lot of these revenue adjustments yesterday. With additional increases, what you do see here that's different than yesterday, though, is we did have, and we talked about this in some of the, in particular, in grant revenues, we had some increases to tie out the budget. We saw, for example, in the Homeland Security grant area and in some other areas in the clerk of quarters area, for example, we had some increases in revenues to total out for a general fund of about $354 million. Oops, sorry. In the uses of funds area, again, yesterday we talked about the use of vacant and funded positions. We're going to propose to address the nearly $7 million reduction in Health and Human Services, restoring about $1 million to HHS. In Public Safety, we had about a $3.8 million carryover, and we would propose to take about $1 million and provide back about a million of the $3.8 million that was provided in Public Safety carryover, restore $1 million of that, so there's $1 million for Public Safety, about $1 million for HHS. Open Space would not receive a general fund contribution, but it does have significant reserves this year. General Liability and Health Insurance has received significant savings this year to the tune of about $300,000 and about $759,000. We had a number of other departmental reductions to the tune of about $284,000. There's a rebudget for probation to the tune of about $342,000. This is for additional deputy probation officers in the anticipation of early release program. This is in anticipation of increased state release of prisoners that could be coming back to the county. And again, for the grant and other revenue increases, there's matching amounts of expenditure increases from what I just showed you on the earlier slide. So again, our uses of funds matches our increased revenues to the tune of about $354 million. So the balance for the general fund would be $354 in revenues, $354 in expenditures. Any questions on that?
No.
Okay. If there aren't any questions on that, we'd like to now turn to Therese Leonard, who's going to provide you with a multi-year budget projection.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Therese Leonard with the Executive Office. One of the things that I like to do as I'm looking forward is actually take a step back and look at what's been going on with the county over the last decade, because it does actually feed into where we're going. So essentially, what's happened in this county and in the cities in this county has been a tremendous explosion of population and development growth. It's similar to the boom town during the gold mining days, where all of a sudden, overnight, towns just formed. It felt like that in the early 2000s. So what happened was the need to provide services grew exponentially in addition to the growth that happened out in county, and our staffing pattern grew. This was a very interesting time because recruitments were difficult. It was really hard to bring talent into the county, especially at the pace that was needed in order to fulfill the service and delivery needs. We had increased needs in our planning departments for plan check, building inspection, the permit levels just grew exponentially. The assessment role had to be looked at, the valuations redone. It was an incredible time, and our population in the county grew outside and inside. What this meant then is that we had critical needs that we needed to address by the board. Because of the infusion of cash that came in the early 2000s, the board had a tremendous opportunity available to itself, and it took advantage of that. At this point in time, the board adopted written financial and budget policies, a debt policy that has since guided the development of our county budget and our financial operations. 3 key things happened during this time. The board started planning for our future. Over a series of years, excess funding, predominantly one-time funding from carryover fund balance, was set into reserves. Again, it happened over time, over a series of years. With the advent of the new accounting standard, GASB 45, which required the recording of the liability associated with retirement benefits that were not pension-related, because those had already been recorded, the board proactively, in advance of when the standard actually went into place, began to set aside between $5 and $10 million a year to pre-fund that unfunded liability. The most recent actuarial report that has been done through June 30th, 2009, has our unfunded liability at $212 million for that obligation. The third thing that the board did was they started looking around at our infrastructure. And while I'm not a construction person, I can look out at DeWitt and know that those buildings were not created to last 100 to 200 years. And so what the board did at that time was they started looking into the future. Okay, we need to plan for our infrastructure. So what did they do? Any excess funds, one-time funds, carryover fund balance, they started setting aside towards capital infrastructure. Probably in the late 90s, the capital facility impact fees were negotiated with the cities, and those started to roll into the county to help offset the costs of new facilities related to growth in the cities and in the counties. A stroke of good luck allowed us to securitize our master settlement agreement revenue, tobacco settlement revenue. It brought in an infusion of cash, which really helped accelerate the construction during that period of time. We also started actively lobbying the federal government and brought in millions of dollars to also help offset some of these project costs. Key to that also was an ongoing commitment by the board for a general fund contribution in addition to all of that. And at that point, it was sort of set at about a $10 million level. The outcome of that, we were able to construct a multitude of buildings. Prior to this last decade, the only building that had been built really was the Finance Administrative Center, and that was in the late 1990s. Prior to that, we did like the little juvenile detention facility, but that had been it in the last century of this county. This is phenomenal. So what the board did was they actually planned for the future. The only facility that required issuing debt on this list was for the South Placer Courthouse, where we issued $34 million. All of the others were paid for with cash. So how did this happen? We were very fortunate in Placer County. The growth that happened during these boom years brought in tens of millions of dollars of extra money for this county. It helped provide these additional services. It helped provide for the additional staff required. As you can see on this chart, there were about 2 years of that. Unlike the state government, which has a serious structural budget deficit, where they started creating a reliance on these infusions of one-time growth components, our board didn't do that. Our board set aside money prudently, worked within a reasonable level to provide for operations, so that when fiscal year 2007-8 hit and the growth did not occur at the same level in the general fund as it had the 2 prior years, we were prepared for that. We were ready to address it. When you go from a $34 million infusion to a $7 million infusion, it is a significant shift when you're building a budget. When you're trying to absorb labor cost increases, other increases like for utilities, just the cost of doing business, during this time, construction costs were going up like 10% a year. It was just a phenomenal time for cost to also rise. The next one. So what we know as we went through this period of time is that not all revenues react the same way at the same time. Different revenues grew faster than others, and this is key to when we're looking into the future. Revenues are not going to all of a sudden one year magically grow. They're going to do it at a different pace every time. So these are just a few samplings. I think our peak year in terms of revenue for construction permits, real property transfer tax, I believe Gloria Coots talked a little bit about that yesterday in her clerk recorder presentation. That was back in 2005, 2006. Those were the peaks. For sales tax, I looked at that one. 2006 was the peak for sales tax. At that point in time, folks started ratcheting back what they were spending, and our growth was just not as high. Property taxes in general, lag behind. So as we start seeing some recovery in this county, we will not see it that year in our property tax revenue. It will be at least a year delayed, at least a year. Public safety sales tax also peaked around the 2006-2007 year at about $37 million. In the 9-10 budget, it's actually reflected at $27 million. That is a huge reduction for that fund in terms of revenue, about 26%. So prior to 2008, the magic year, as the revenue growth started to contract, the county had to still provide the same level of service, but we needed to start doing it a little differently. And this is where the magical net reduction budgets came into play. And any department head out there who has a general fund budget knows what a net reduction budget is. Essentially, absorb all your cost increases within your current funding levels. We're not going to give you any more money. That's essentially what happened. It happened over a series of years. The other thing that occurred was the state decided, in their infinite wisdom, that we could continue to provide our health and human services without any kind of cost increases. And so between $4 and $6 million, depending on the year, we had to absorb because our labor costs would go up and the state would not pay for it. So we kept seeing a increased pushback by the state to make us provide the services sort of on our own dime, where they weren't going to reimburse us. The result of this, general fund departments have been seriously challenged to continue to provide the same levels of service that they had in the past. And the reason being is that essentially we reduced the funding to general fund departments in order to increase funding to support public safety and health and human service programs. And those were the priorities of the board at that time. And again, this is over a series of years. You've seen this chart before. It was up on the screen yesterday, but it just illustrates the point that over the last several years, the contribution to our criminal justice services has gone up rather significantly, and that most other contributions have remained either flat or gone down. In order to work within the budget constraints that we've experienced over the last several years, the capital contribution level has also had to diminish. And we're at this point at about $4.5 million. That's significantly under the $10 million commitment that we had, say, a decade ago. This year is the very first year, as we did our wrap-up of the year-end close process, that we really didn't have additional monies to set aside into reserves, into capital reserves. Last few years, $10 million, $20 million were set aside, not this year. So we're seeing a significant change. We're not alone. You know, there's some comfort in that. The federal government, the state government, cities, counties, special districts, most of them have been facing a significant shift with the economic downturn. And essentially what's happening is that their revenue base is either flat or declining, and their cost of doing business is going up. Couple this with the state pools, impacts, loans, Proposition 1A, huge, huge impact across the state of California. Having said that, you know, as I look through the CalPELRA, which is a personnel agency news clips, about a year ago, you know, there'd be 5, 10 different clips. Now, pages, layoffs, furloughs, cutbacks, all across the state of California. It is just amazingly dire out there. And it is really, again, and I'm going back to years ago when you all started planning for our future and knowing that the economy is a cycle. It goes up, it goes down, and we needed money set aside. We're probably the only county in the state who is not laying off staff this year. That is huge. We've made a promise to our PPEO employees that there will be no layoffs through June 30th, 2010. So what's happened since then is that as we started going into this economic downturn, staff realized that our revenue base that we had put into the 08-09 budget was not going to be sustainable, that the collections were going to not come in at the level that was anticipated. And so proactively, your board took measures at that point in time. So in December of 2008, we revised the budget rather significantly, $9.5 million. We reduced our revenue base because we knew we weren't going to collect those funds. And we offset that reduction with reserves, $1.7 million, rainy day funds that your board has set aside in previous years. We implemented 4 days of mandatory time off, which saved the county about $2 million. We reduced the contribution in the road fund to zero for the road overlay program. We further unfunded vacant positions, 40 vacant positions, 19 in the general fund, 21 in the public safety fund. And then we reduced our allocation listing, which has our total position allocations, by 76. Those were vacant and unfunded positions. But then we're not done. That was for the fiscal year 2008-09 budget. Then we're looking ahead to the fiscal year 9-10 budget, which is actually what these workshops are about. In February, we recognized that at that point, before the state did their final actions, that we had about an $18.6 million shortfall. And that shortfall is a consolidation of the general fund and the public safety fund. As Sheriff Bonner indicated yesterday, the public safety fund is predominantly funded by the general fund. At that point in time, proposals were brought forward to your board to balance a proposed budget that would come forward later that year in May. And it was suggested, recommended at that time, that we start using some of those rainy day funds to augment this shortfall. $4 million has been set aside in the proposed budget to help offset the shortfall. In addition to that, negotiated agreement with the PPEO, Employees Union, Management and Confidential discussions gleaned another $6.7 million in savings, predominantly related to 12 days of mandatory time off during fiscal year 9-10. That does not close the budget gap, so other reductions were needed, and these were more permanent reductions to services and supplies, professional service contracts. Anywhere that we could cut, we cut another $7.9 million. It was not a perfect solution, and it was mentioned to your board that a lot of the tools that were used to balance that proposed budget were one-time in nature. The cancellation of reserves, the MTO days, all one-time in nature, essentially. Once the money's gone, it's gone. We are in a real cost-cutting mode right now. I don't know that there was one department head that came up and said, thank you for all the extra money yesterday. Every single one of them was up and saying, well, we've had to reduce staff, we've had to cut our budget. So we're in a very strong cost-cutting mode. The reason why those two board actions, December and February, were so important is they pulled us back into alignment. It rebalanced the 8-9 budget so that as we closed out the year, we were in much better position. And it gave us a balanced proposed budget moving forward for 9-10. It set the stage to have significantly reduced deficits in the outlying model years that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Without taking corrective action or just plugging the hole with reserves, we would have had huge deficits next year and the year after. We have a significant deficit now, but it would have been huge. It also gave the department heads the direction to constrain their costs, seek further efficiencies. And I think that we heard department heads talk about that yesterday. They were changing the way they were doing business. They had to. They have less money, they have less staff, they're changing the way they're doing business. The benefit to the county is that as we move into the final budget, we now have $9 million more in carryover fund balance than we anticipated. And it's because of this savings. Essentially, about 330 positions of our allocation listing are either, they're unfilled, they're vacant. Of that, 190 were funded. So when you don't fill a funded position, you have carryover fund balance. So that is what has really benefited this county with this Proposition 1A pool of a loan from the state of about $11 million. It will help to offset that, and that's from the department's good works. Longer term, we still have challenges. You know, while I would like to stand beside Sheriff Bonner and Doc Burton and say, yes, I'm optimistic and I think things are going to get better, I really, as your fiscal representative, can't say that. Based on what I'm seeing in the state of California, we will not recover at the same pace as the rest of the nation. We are in much more dire circumstance because of the structural problems at the state level. Unemployment, traditionally, once you start a recovery, and I mean start, we're not there yet, will continue to grow for another year. That will have an impact on our county. It will impact our real estate property values. It will impact our retail sales revenue. It will impact our construction. It will impact everything. So I don't think we've hit bottom. I think we have a ways to go. The other thing that we're noticing is that we're starting to see declines in other revenue streams, in addition to the ones related to the housing sector. Public safety sales tax is a really good example of that. And it is not a logically derived revenue stream. It is a state formula, a magical state formula, whereby they take all the money collected and then they allocate it to all the counties based on a magical formula based on prior year growth in sales tax. A little complicated, but bottom line, we're going to see our allocation percentage drop. This year, it already has. Next year, I expect it to drop again. Even if retail sales go up in the state next year, our percentage of that base will be less. So we will see a decline in our public safety sales tax, most probably next year. So since that time, we've also had the state budget approved, and we have additional hits to our county that are being addressed with this workshop. About $5.5 million for health and human service programs, another $11 million pool on Proposition 1A, one-time loan to the state. Good news on that is that at least it'll be restored next year. And then at some point, they'll pay us back with interest. It's supposed to be within 3 years, but we'll see. The other things that we're seeing is realignment revenues down, sales tax driven. Because we have less resources, we've had to focus our dollars in the most efficient and effective way possible, and the key to that has been trying to minimize the impact on our customers, on our residents in Placer County. So, since the last review, we do have a glimmer of good news. The last model that we talked about had rather significant increases in salaries and benefits. At that point in time, the information that we have from CalPERS was that the PERS rates, which is based on a percentage of payroll, was going to go up anywhere from 2 to 10% in 1 year. Since that time, CalPERS, right or wrong, has implemented a smoothing methodology whereby local governments will not be impacted in year 10 and 11. Essentially, the rates will stay flat. And then they will gradually phase in what the investment law portfolio will require, which is additional funding, over the following 3 years. The biggest impact to our county will be in year 13 when we have a 2% additional hit on the CalPERS rates. I'm assuming that the reasoning behind this is that we'll be in recovery mode by then. Revenues will start to regenerate and we'll be able to meet that obligation. The other boon to the county was in the health insurance rates. At the point in time where we built the model, we were projecting out a mid-year adjustment of about 8%. Over the last 10 years, increases in health insurance premium rates has been in the double digits. So 8% seemed reasonable. They've been going down a little bit. CalPERS implemented a new structure to how they were assigning rates. We are now in what we call a Sacramento base as opposed to a Bay Area base. The benefit to the county is in 9-10, the rates went down for the first time in a very, very long time. So our starting point to build the model actually went down. The base went down. Unfortunately, we're still seeing a continued decline in our revenues. A little bit of good news is that we've been working with the Deputy Sheriff's Association to implement some labor adjustments that should benefit the Public Safety Fund. On the horizon, again, we've been in a planning mode for a long time. We have been looking to our future. One of the key facilities that is in that mode is the jail down at South County. It is a $98 million price tag on that facility. We have set aside $32 million from the general fund and further obligated another $26 out of capital facility impact fees. That leaves a gap of about $39 million. That $39 million will have to be funded either through ongoing contributions from the general fund, reserves set aside for capital outlay, or additional capital facility impact fees. And as we go through the next 2 years, we'll be evolving that strategy depending on what's going on with the economy and the budget itself. That facility is scheduled to open in 2012. And so as I'm modeling this out, I'm doing about a mid-year, turn the key, open the door. The biggest impact is in year 13-14. It is a new operating cost of $20 to $23 million. It has not been factored into our current budget. Some of the other facilities listed on this PowerPoint are fully funded, so the biggest concern right now is the jail. So the recommendations that are being brought forward to your board today for the final budget for 2009-10 will not close deficits for future years. They will help, but they will not close the deficits. Predominantly because our costs are going to grow. Labor agreements are going to have cost increases. Whether or not it's related to a COLA, it could be health insurance increases, PERS rate increases. One of the plans that the board put in place several years ago was to start ramping up our percentage of payroll OPEB charges in order to start pulling in money from the operations to help fund that obligation. If we were in keeping with what the actuarial recommendation was, we would be charging 15.5% of every dollar of payroll. We are now in 9-10 at about 9%. The model reflects a 2% increase per year. So essentially, we're trying to ramp it back up. We had to pull it back this year in order to stay within our funding constraints, but the plan is to ramp it up. We expect to see flat or declining revenues over the next few years. Even my most optimistic viewpoint here says that once we start recovering, it's going to be relatively flat. It's not going to be like what we saw in the early 2000s. It's going to be flat, slower growth. You're not going to see $34 million increases, $26 million increases. You're going to see 5, 6, much smaller growth. I probably mentioned 3 or 4 times already, but the state budget is a problem. It is a problem for our budget. It is a problem for our state. It will not be fixed with the measures that they've put in place to balance this year's budget. I'm sure that I counted at least 10 times where staff were alerting you to the fact that we think their revenue projections are way optimistic and that somewhere around December, January, they're going to come back and say, oh, we don't have enough revenue and we've got another problem. So the state is going to continue to impact us into the future. I can't project that in a model. I have no way of knowing what that's going to look like. So just assume it doesn't include in future years any additional impacts. The impacts we know today are included. No future impacts at this point. The other reason why we're going to have deficits in outlying years is because we have used one-time funds or solutions to close our budget gaps. With the recognition that we're doing that on purpose, we set aside reserves, which we know are one-time funds, for these rainy days. It's raining, it's storming out there. So we're doing that. We are recommending to the board that we continue to do that, probably for the next year, maybe 2 years. But that's going to bring its own set of problems, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. We have a rather mature workforce. So the good news is, or the bad news, the good news is that we expect, through attrition and retirements, that our workforce will be reduced. That will save us in salaries and benefits. And with the hiring freeze that your board implemented in 2007, that should help us close the deficit. Unfortunately, where people retire from is not necessarily where you need them to leave, but it'll help. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about the model. What I've projected out is just 1 year, and I'll speak to what I see happening in the other years. But you can see the effect of some of the actions that the board has taken. If you look at the 2008-9 revised budget, that reflects the reduction of $9.5 million in revenue. And I guess one of the things I want to point out is this is a consolidation of the general fund and the public safety fund. All duplications have been removed. So for instance, we give a contribution to public safety of about $73 million. That revenue and expense have been taken out of this picture, and any similar types of things, so that we're looking at a real picture. If they consolidated in, this is what it would look like. One of the things that you'll note is that the revenue and carryover figures decline significantly over each of the board actions. From the revised budget in December of 2008 to the proposed budget that was adopted in May to what we're recommending today in the final budget, and then projecting out into the future. One of the reasons for the reduction is the carryover fund balance. We were blessed, again, with a very nice fund balance. In the general fund, it was $33 million. In the public safety fund, it was $5 million for the 09-10 budget. Next year's projection is about $25 million in the general fund and another $4 million in the public safety fund. And that's generous. The infusion, another reason for the infusion in 9-10 and carryover is we closed out probably $5 million in trust accounts. These were funds that were not needed. We closed them out to the general fund. It fell to carryover. We canceled some designations. There was another $1 million. So we had benefits in this year that we're not going to see next year. This is probably my most optimistic point, is that in the secured tax revenue for 10-11, I've left it flat. And that is optimistic. So if it comes in less than that, the deficit grows. And assume for every percent about $1 million. Public safety sales tax, I've projected a 3% decline. And most other revenues like sales tax, I've tried to keep them flat. This is one time I don't want to overreact in terms of being conservative with my revenues, because it will have an impact on our operations. Expenses will grow. Our labor expenses in particular are going to continue to grow. The PPEO contract expires June 30th, 2010. We will be entering into new negotiations for a new contract. At this point in time, those represented employees are not, there's no wage increases in terms of COLAs or anything like that anticipated, because we don't have a contract. Deputy Sheriff's Association, Measure F, guides their salary increases. What that will be, we won't really know until around February. In the model, I've projected it coming in about 4%. Over the last several years, it's ranged anywhere from 5 to 7. So, again, the economy's different. The benchmark agencies that we're looking at have been ratcheting back. So 4% may or may not be reasonable. It's just a figure. Probation officers are the only group within PPEO that are promised a rate increase. It will go into place February 2010, 3%. And that was part of the negotiation that occurred about a year ago. The one thing I will caution the board is that all reductions to the road program, capital infrastructure, open space have not been restored. When we unfunded a position, it has not been restored. So all the ratcheting back that we've done in this model, looking out next year, has not been restored. And we're still looking at an $18 million deficit. If we look out into the future, 11, 12, 25 million. 12, 13, 44 million. 13, 14, when the jail's fully operational, 68 million. So our work is still ahead. We're not done. This is going to go on for a while, but we're good at this now. We're doing a good job. So county reserves, you know, key to county reserves is the ability to fund our operation with cash. Money that we've set aside, we used to fund until we get our property tax in December, 6 months of operations. We use it as our cash base so that we don't have to borrow money like other counties or cities to operate. When the state decides they are not going to send us revenues for 6 months or a year, and we have paid for the service that it was for. We are advance funding it. The reserves help with the cash to fund it before we get the reimbursement. So my caution here is as we pull down on these reserves, and yes, it's a good time to be doing it, it's a rainy day, it's storming out, as we pull down on them, we have less cash available to fund our operations. The more we pull, the tighter it gets. So, you know, in keeping with our budget and finance policies, using reserves judiciously is really important, with the understanding that it's one-time funding, and at some point in time, we've got to have a plan to reverse it, to phase it out, and to start funding our operations with our ongoing revenue. These are extreme economic circumstances that we're facing today and will be facing next year. So if there's any time to do it, now is the time. Here's a picture representation of the reserves. Assuming a continuation of a $4 million drawdown on reserves through the year 13-14 in order to offset budget shortfalls, we will only have $13.9 million cash in the general fund and public safety fund reserves. That is in keeping with the finance plan for the capital facilities in order to draw down and pay for construction of the jail. So essentially, we have two things that are going to be drawing down on our reserves: the capital infrastructure for the construction of the jail and the need to fund our ongoing operations of about $4 million a year. I think that even does.
Yes?
So the 13-14 year, the dramatic drawdown in the reserve balance is a function of the jail, both the capital construction part and the operations. It's not clear to me how much of the reserve is being drawn down by operations. I'm not so worried about the capital side of it because that's not going to be an ongoing structural change to the budget. The operational side will be, however, so could you develop that a little bit more, I guess?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. Essentially, the way the model projects out is, in keeping with what we've done this year, is an additional draw of $4 million each year. So in 10-11, there's a $4 million draw on reserves. In 11-12, there's a $4 million draw on reserves, and so on through the year 13-14. It is that $4 million that we're pulling each year, and we're not pushing any more in, that's pushing that number down to $1.8 million from the $17.8 it is today.
Okay, thanks. And when I say that I'm not concerned about the reserves drawn from the capital side of that, I'm not concerned about that if we plan for it as we have over the last 15 years, because that
Very prudent
it will not
planning.
represent a structural change in the budget. Thanks.
And then with that, if there are any questions from the board, I'd be happy to take them.
Kurt?
Would you go back and review, please? I think you mentioned the updated OPEB obligation today. Our unfunded liability is what?
The unfunded liability with the last actuarial is $212 million. That's actually down from the 2007 report at $232.
That's just the OPEB. What about the pension?
That's just the OPEB. The pension obligation at this point, the present value is over, it's like just a little over $1 billion. The unfunded liability in PERS is behind 2 years. The actuarial that we have is based on asset values at the end of 2007, June 2007. At that point in time, we were 94% funded with the miscellaneous plan, which left an unfunded liability of about $100 million. And then we were funded 85% for the safety plan, which left an unfunded liability of about $50 million. So essentially, in the pension, it's about $150, $160 million unfunded liability.
So
Plus the $240 for OPEB.
212.
Yeah, 212 today, 243.
Thanks.
Now, having said that, because of the investment losses that have happened since 2007, it will change significantly.
Well, not just the investment losses, but you also, I mean, you couch it as good news, and it is from a cash flow standpoint, but from a total accrued liability standpoint, It's obviously not good news that we're entering in this rate smoothing where for 2 years you're not going to see the increases because those unfunded obligations will obviously continue to grow during that time, won't be drawn down during that time. So do we have a guess as to what will be happening during that time? Looking at total assets and liabilities as opposed to our cash flow, do we have a guess as to what's going to be happening in that regard when we start talking about our unfunded obligation over the next couple of years? Everything we've discussed has been cash flow, and that's important. But from our ability to bond and all the rest, obviously they're looking at our entire financial health, and that's where that unfunded obligation really comes in and bites us.
With regard to the pension obligation, that's been reported because it was required to be reported under GASB over years and years and years. The OPEB is a brand-new requirement, and they are phasing it in. So the component part that goes on our financials is that year's obligation in relationship to a amortization. Right now, we are fully funded in accordance with the premise on GASB 45. We are paying 100% of our ARC.
Right. On our existing obligation, meeting our obligations incurred as of today.
As of today.
Right.
These actuarials are based on current, active, and retired employees. It does not look into the future for new hires.
Right. No, I know. Okay.
And just a couple of comments on that. On the positive side of negative news is a decreased workforce ends up reducing your OPEB obligation over time. So I think what we saw in our actuary is fewer employees plus a better rate, lesser increase in the cost of health care, which in balance reduced our OPEB obligation this year. But as per the board, we've been funding that and meeting our obligation under what the annual payment is. So from a credit rating, I think the agencies would look at that and say, fine. From the PERS aspect of it on pension obligations, you are mandated to pay those costs. So from a credit rating, doesn't matter what happens in the rest of the county, but you will have to pay your PERS expense even if it absorbs an increasing share of your benefits and salaries. And so that will be an automatically funded obligation first in terms of your priorities of pay. But there could be clearly other impacts to county abilities to provide the wherewithal resources because you'd be consuming more of those just simply in benefit and payroll purposes.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Or Jennifer?
Thank you. Great recap of the past, the present, and
Thank you.
crystal ball gazing into the future. I think if I heard you correctly, you said by 2013 we're looking at a budget deficit of $44 million?
12-13 is 44, 13-14 is 68. And a big chunk of that is a half-year phase-in for the jail operations in that first year and full year the second year.
Mm-hmm. And that was exactly where I was going. Thank you. By 2013, you're projecting 20 to 23 million in operating costs at the jail.
A new operating cost.
New operating costs, right. I'm assuming we are already looking at how we think we could potentially raise some additional revenues to fund that. Am I correct in thinking that?
I think that what's happening is the Criminal Justice Policy Group is actually looking at ways of doing business, and they will be coming up with strategies. It is a phenomenal amount of money, and looking at every avenue. Becky, do you want to address that further?
There are a couple of areas that we are focusing on now to do just that. There are some scheduled meetings coming up where we intend to review all of our potential revenue sources. The Sheriff's Department has the ability to charge for incarceration fees. Probation Department has the ability to charge for some of their services. And we are also looking at trying to increase the fees that we receive for the public defender services we provide. And in addition, I spoke yesterday about a task force that is looking at some technology solutions. Those won't bring immediate reductions, but are anticipated to bring some savings in the future.
And are these operating costs, are we factoring in the prisoners that are going to be returning to us from the state in those costs?
In the projections?
Yeah.
we did capture those.
Have we thought about the,
costs. We have set aside money to cover for that, what we anticipate to be coming from the state. We set aside money for 4 additional probation officers that will be responsible for supervising those folks when they come back to us. So we have factored that money in
into
this
the,
current budget.
into the 2013 costs, not just next year? Sorry.
Thank you, Becky. Essentially, the way the modeling has worked is that the base year becomes the final budget, 9/10, and moves forward. So all actions that are being recommended are incorporated in and moving forward. So as Becky mentioned, the 4 DPOs are included. When we look at the $23 million operating cost for the jail, there is no state funding for that. And so that is all on the county. It is a county-wide service that we provide, and it will be the county's responsibility to fund it. There are some revenue offsets that it sounds like we can glean, but the majority of that will be funding needed.
Yeah, and let me speak to the other
Thank
thing
you.
outside of our county funding, is that this board has been very tough on new development and requiring ongoing service fees when projects have been approved. So there is a leveling cost, especially on growth in the West, that they need to pay for that increment that taxes do not provide, whether it's criminal justice or other county services. In some cases, that's almost $1,000 dwelling unit, if not more, that would be paid by the Western development that is absolutely necessary to help fund part of these additional costs. The other thing, too, is that, especially a near and dear fact to Supervisor Wygant, is the Sunset Industrial Area is looked at as a key area for economic growth that will provide a surplus of revenue over the service cost under the tax formulas that will then provide a much, and especially in light of this, a mandatory funding source that we need to retain to help offset these kind of costs. So the Sunset Industrial Area is extremely important to the long-term viability of the county in terms of that area being developed and staying with there. That will then provide the resources to pay for especially some of these criminal justice expenses as that area grows.
Thank you.
When we approved the construction of the jail, I was impressed the way the architects designed it so we could have less staff, than one person could oversee the pods. Has there been any discussion about contracting for the services at the jail?
Let me address that. I think that's clearly an avenue that we need to explore over the next 2 years. There hasn't been any detailed work on that to date, but when you look at the type of costs that we're incurring, we have to turn over every rock to find out what's the most economic and best serving to our citizens.
Robert?
I just wanted to add to Tom's comments that I'm sure staff is aware of this, but for everyone's benefit, it's not obvious that if the Sunset Industrial Area stays whole, as per recent discussions over the last few years, with efforts to try to annex some of those properties to other jurisdictions, it will in fact be profitable to the county, but the key to remember is that the absorption rate of that market will be very slow compared to the residential side, so that the demand for services from residences will increase at a much more dramatic rate than the development of the Sunset Industrial Area if the county keeps that whole jurisdiction, and we'll need to plan for those revenue lags accordingly.
If I might, just one other aspect in our tax negotiation agreements with the cities, we are very clearly bringing to the forefront that in new development in the cities, and remember that's where most of the folks who go through our criminal justice system are citizens of the cities, is that they need to look at a partnership providing funding in their new development on an ongoing basis to defray some of those costs that we incur serving those populations as a whole within their jurisdiction.
I just have kind of a question and a comment. Moving forward, we're just getting by right now trying to shuffle with furloughs and things like that to make ends meet. What are we going to do if this continues? I mean, what are we going to put a plan together so that we look at, are we going to have to change our structure for how many people work for this county? Or how are we going to be able to pay for these types of things as we move forward? Because over time, over the next couple of years, I'm sure we're going to read in the paper that we're hiding money and we're doing this and we're doing that, and all of those things are going to be leveled at us. But I mean, this is as plain as day. We're in a declining revenue stream coming in, so therefore we have to put in our house in order, or as Kirk used yesterday, right size to how we deliver those services.
Yeah, let me take a swing at that. There's a new term that's being used in budget land and county exec level. It's called the new normal. Is that the new normal is different than the past, and it is not that we will return to the old normal of 2000 and late 1990s. There's a new resetting. The home equities are gone. The inflated values are gone. The spending that charges the retail sales, that fueled the property taxes, that will not come back. Yes, we'll see a slight increase in sales tax and property tax will stabilize, but there is a new normal with a lesser, we will not have the steep inclines of revenues, and we need to collectively adjust to that new normal in the way we do business and how we pay for things all across the board. And that's going to be our challenges. While your board has put us in a good position that it's not a crash descent right now, we need to take the time over this next year to adjust to that new normal in terms of being able to sustain the operations that our citizens deserve and need, and do it in a cost-effective manner and change our normal to what that new normal is. So that's an easy answer for you.
Mr. Chairman,
Okay, right size and new normal.
I would prefer to call the old normal as the abnormal.
Anyway, thank you for a very good presentation.
Thank you.
I mean, it's bad news, but we need to hear it. Thank you.
With that, I'll turn the stage over to Becky Regan and Mark Giacomini to talk about budget recommendations for the Sheriff's Department.
Before Mark and Becky come up to present their public safety and sheriff presentation, though, if I could briefly, I'm going to just show you a slide very briefly. This just is a depiction of county expenditures and actual expenditures over operating expenditures over time. Just to stop very briefly on this slide, what it shows you is by categories our expenditures as they've traveled over time. In categories, you can just kind of see the broad categories of public protection, health and public assistance, general government, public ways and facilities, and then recreation, education, and promotions. And this is just kind of what they've done. Basically, this is going from 99 to where we're at today. And we just kind of wanted to give you a flavor for that trending as it's gone from 99 to 2009-10, and just kind of give you that flavor, just to stop on that briefly as we head into the next component of our conversation, because I know we're about to talk about a couple areas of both public safety and in health and human services. So with that, we'll go ahead and start. What's that? Oh, yeah. Sure. With that, here's Becky and Mark.
Good morning. Becky Regan from the County Executive Office, and here with me is Mark Giacomini. He is the analyst for both the Sheriff's Department and Health and Human Services. And I apologize for displacing my colleagues, but we wanted to sit here so we could see the slides as we were reviewing them and speaking with you about them. This morning we are here to discuss final budget recommendations for the Sheriff's Department and for Health and Human Services. Each of these departments provides core county government services and programs that protect the health and safety of the residents of Placer County. And each of these departments have experienced declines in their revenues that we believe warrant further consideration this morning. Each department relies on a distinct sales tax-based revenue as a significant portion of their overall funding. Public safety sales tax for the Sheriff's Department and realignment revenues for Health and Human Services. During the declining economy over the past couple of years, these revenues have experienced relatively significant declines. And the remaining shortfall for final budget 2009-10 for each of these revenues is approximately $2.6 for the Sheriff's Office and $1.4 million for Health and Human Services. Our recommendations today are to close approximately two-thirds of this gap for each department in recognition of the fact that these revenues should at least partially rebound as the economy recovers over the next couple of years. So we'll begin by discussing the sheriff's final budget recommendations. To provide some context for the discussion this morning, we prepared a few slides that demonstrate the recent trends for public safety funding. This slide demonstrates the combined expenditures and revenue trends for public safety budgets since 2004 and 5. The blue area represents total public safety expenditures and breaks down the key revenue components for these departments. The red area demonstrates general fund contribution trends that have steadily increased, most notably over the last couple of years. General funding has gone from $38 million in fiscal year 2004-5 to $70 million in fiscal year 2009-10. And this, of course, has an inverse relationship to the public safety sales tax represented in the green space, as those revenues have been declining. The bottom area in yellow captures other revenue sources for the departments, such as grant revenues, contracts with other agencies. This is an expanded view of the general fund contribution trends for each of the public safety departments and for another county executive-controlled budget called Contribution to Public Safety, which is where we fund a number of things that support public safety functions, such as increased information technology costs. And because the probation and district attorney's offices have similar budgets with similar general fund contributions, you will notice they essentially mirror each other on this graph. The probation budget is actually the yellow line peeking out from behind the district attorney's information in green. The red area captures the general fund contribution to the sheriff's budget over the last several years, and you will notice a steadily increasing trend line with a fairly significant spike of $9.4 million in fiscal year 2007-8. This slide demonstrates the total expenditures and key revenue trends for the Sheriff's Department over the last couple of years. These figures reflect our recommendations to increase, that we'll be discussing here in a few moments in detail, but to generally increase the general fund contribution by $1 million and asking the department to reduce its spending authority by another $1 million. So again, the total expenditures for the department are in blue, and this slide clearly demonstrates that since final budget 2008-9, there have been reductions to the department's spending authority. And again, this is due largely to the changing economy and the revenue reductions that have been experienced in both the public safety sales tax and in the general fund revenues. And again, just as a point of reference, those revenues have reduced $7 million year over year in public safety sales tax, and we have a $22 million reduction, a net reduction to general fund year over year. Any questions on these slides for now? We will start with a quick summary of the department's budgets over the recent history. The 2008-9 final budget was $97.5 million. This was their expenditure authority improved in the fiscal year 8-9 final budget. The department's 2009-10 proposed budget was reduced to $95 million and reflects several things. An $811,000 mid-year reduction to reflect the declines we were seeing in public safety sales tax. Now, at that point, our approach to budgeting was to fully load the department's cost increases each year. We wanted to really understand what the departments would be facing as they looked ahead. So at that point, we asked the departments to identify their costs, increases in cost of doing business, and then we asked the public safety departments to reduce those costs by 3%. General fund departments were asked to reduce by 5%. So this $95 million figure represents the 3% reduction that the departments took at that time. The department's 9-10 final budget, with their final budget adjustments, was $93,675,000. Now, this was after the department submitted expenditure reductions of approximately $2.3 million. 1.5 of that was reduced grant expenditures tied directly to reduced grant funding. The reduction of $600,000 to reflect actual costs for providing court security services. And there was an inadvertent double budgeting of utility costs of $440,000. That was reduced. And reduced jail food and medical costs of approximately $250,000. The general fund contribution from 8.9 to 9.10 proposed final budget remained constant. So at this point, to return to the public safety impact, or the impact of the public safety sales tax revenue, there were, again, no funding impacts from the state budget. There were some initial proposals that were presented, but those were all eliminated in the final budget. So again, the primary thing we are focusing on here is the reduction in the public safety sales tax revenue. And again, the piece that we're looking at from proposed budget to final budget is $2.6 million. So the 910 gross budget for the department, again, that $93,675,000 starting place, reflected a $3.2 million shortfall. And some summary of some details about how we have this $3.2 million shortfall that I'd like to go over very briefly. In the 910 proposed budget, the department had a $3.4 million, what we refer to as a net county cost, but essentially a shortfall at that point. They were able to, they had available a $1.2 million fund balance, which reduced their shortfall to $2.2 million. At that point, the department submitted some additional final budget adjustments that had a net increase of $956,000. I'm reading that. 900, is that? Yeah, whatever. Can't read that number from here. The total shortfall after the final budget adjustments then expanded up to $3.2 million. And that's the starting place for our discussion to close the gap at this point. So again, to go over our recommended solutions to close the $3.2 million shortfall, it's composed of three components. The first one is we would like to identify the cost savings or reductions in cost of doing business that the department was able to realize this year. And those components are reduction in employee group insurance for $231,000 and a reduction of general liability for $240,000, and then the DSA labor adjustments for $655,000. So those savings would be allowed to be absorbed within the department, and the department would be allowed to keep those revenues. The second component would be a budget adjustment or new general fund contribution of approximately $1 million. And then finally, our third component is to ask the department to absorb another $1 million, or approximately 1.1% of their budget. With those adjustments that we just discussed, that would bring their spending authority down to $91,522,000. And that would increase the general fund contribution up to $43.4 million. So that is our recommendation for your board. Are there any questions for us at this point?
Have any questions? Everybody's looking at your numbers. That red's a little hard to see on that blue. Jennifer?
Thank you. Again, great presentation. I'm looking at slide number 34, I believe it is, the next one. Where you talk about the reductions in the cost of doing business and the $1.126 million. Is that the proposal in front of DSA right now, or how does that relate to the proposal in front of DSA right now?
Those are the reductions that the DSA was, had agreed to, I believe.
Well, no. The DSA, the negotiating team, signed that they would recommend that to the Deputy Sheriff's Association. Deputy Sheriff's Association is taking a vote on that issue supposedly last night. We haven't heard what the outcome of that is. The item is, when we last left the labor issue on your board at your last meeting, is it coming forward on September 8th, we would have the, should the DSA as an association approve that, then we would recommend that your board concur with that. Should they vote it down, then we would recommend that your board impose the last, best, and final, which actually has a little bit more savings. It's hard to determine the actual amount, $50,000 to $70,000, but not that big of a difference. But those, so when we have the labor savings up there, it's either the DSA votes something in, or our recommendation would be that the board impose near equivalent savings on September 8th.
So just to be totally clear, if the DSA does not accept that proposal, does not vote in favor of that proposal, there will be an additional $1.126 million shortfall.
And if your board does not impose.
Right.
Correct.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Anybody know the answer?
Actually,
to
just to
that?
clarify that number, it would be a reduction of the 655 shortfall. That full amount, they would still realize the benefit of those other cost savings.
Robert has a question, and I'll turn it over to.
Yeah, just kind of a point of discussion, and anybody county exec's office, I guess, as it relates to the recommendation would help me, I think. But if you go back to slides 28, 29, 30, so maybe we could flick through those quickly. But I want to focus on, the growth in the general fund contributions. So on that slide, it's red. In the next slide, it's also red, and then on the last slide, and that's okay, go back to 30, I guess, is all of the departments, almost all of the departments are recommended to incur significant cuts, a couple of exceptions. On average, it looks like they're about 8%. Is one of the key drivers in the county exec's recommendation with regards to the sheriff's budget the concern about the absorption, the rate of increase of the absorption, the contribution by the general fund, and trying to curtail that over time?
That is, and I'll take a swing at that. That is clearly one of our concerns. Is the analogy I used at your last board meeting is that the general fund is a bucket, and that big bucket usually is able to provide money to the road fund, to public safety as the majority consumer is running also all the other general fund obligations. That bucket is greatly diminished this year, and we expect it to be continuing flat or diminished for next year. You do not have the wherewithal to sustain all the county departments, including public safety, especially to a rate of growth. You probably cannot sustain it to a rate of flatness over the next couple of years, let alone to a rate of growth. So we have to look at how we get back in that new normal with a flattening of expenses. And we just, absent of going deeper into reserves or taking from other areas of expenses that have already suffered multiple years of reductions. Really, the last 2 years in many departments have had, not just this year, but reductions over the past year. Those are really your options, is to flatten out everything, keep it in a, as best you can, flat rather than even a decline, and recognizing the general fund cannot do that unless you want to dip into reserves or contingencies, which exacerbate the problem for next year.
So again, sort of a philosophical question, I guess, so anybody, county exec's office, but I have some comments at the end of the workshop that I'll save for later, but essentially, over the almost 15 years now that I've been around, for better or worse, depending on who you talk to, I think one of the key reasons why our budget is relatively so healthy under current circumstances is because there's been, I've had good colleagues to work with, but I've also had excellent staff that has had a clear understanding as to the structural health of a budget, which, in a nutshell, for me, identifies the expected ongoing revenue streams and matching those against ongoing expenditures as compared to one-time revenues or temporary dips in revenues. So over the long haul, we've been in balance, and I would contrast that against what the state has done over the last few years, maybe 5 years, which is to ignore the structural relationships within a budget and just hope that the economy is going to turn around. So as we look into the next 2 or 3 years, I really appreciate the presentation we had this morning, and the presumption, my for sure vision of what we're going to be up against over the next few years is that regardless of what does happen with the economy, if it bottoms out and improves, I don't think it's going to turn around dramatically like what we've seen over the last 10 years. So in light of getting through the next 3 years, has it been staff's recommendation to try to deal with that fundamental issue, noting the deficits that are inherent in the structure, by trying to balance general fund contribution management with the use of contingency reserves over a 2 to 5 year period?
And eliminate the use of those contingency reserves and make sure our ongoing revenues are with our ongoing expenses. We have to get to that point.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Turn over to Barbara.
Thank you. Well, I did bring the easy button today, but we know that it's not easy, and you guys have some hard decisions. And I'm Barbara Bassana from the Administrative Services Manager for the Sheriff's Department, and you have your work cut out for you. You've done a lot of hard work, made the hard decisions in the past, so that as Robert mentioned, some of the fiscal health of this county is where we are today. So we appreciate that and commend that. Just want to reiterate just a few things as we go forward in your review and your decision-making today. As Robert said on these slides for 28, 29, and 30, there's a demonstration of the general fund contribution and where that cost comes from, and the increases in the department's expenditures. Some of those are throughout the county, so I don't mean to minimize what those are, but just like the cartoon that the sheriff proposed, if it's in a chart, it must be true, and it is, but you can outline those facts in a manner that doesn't really tell the whole story. If you look at the budget for 07, 08, and 08, 09, as we mentioned before, in order to have the budget that was submitted and finally approved by your board, the department initiated reductions in staffing for additional unfunded staffing allocations and reductions to operational available operational costs of about $4.5 million. The increases you see that reflected and that remained were the increases in OPEB costs, which has put this county in a very strong financial position. Increases to retiree health, which again, we're doing that. We also received a COPS grant of about $1.5 million as well. So basically, we held flat our operating salaries and benefits and other operating costs to achieve that. Again, in this year, as we move forward, we have, again, looked at the reductions in sales tax as requested and working through with the proposed budget instructions and preparing the budget for your board for the 3% reductions of $3 million. And again, looking at the reductions in sales tax coupled with the fund balance available, and also the reductions that we were able to make and increase revenues. Now, the $986,000 that you see as an increase is what's left of the remainder of the sales tax reductions of the 2.6 that we were not at that time able to come up with for your review. And what we're looking at here, those reductions over the past few months have totaled about $4.6 million. So we really have shared the pain. We really we have now a total of 42 vacant and unfunded positions, and we really do feel the pain. That the public as well, even though some efficiencies have been realized, we also realize there's a cut back in service levels. As we look forward, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be additional demands on public safety. As Captain Hutchinson mentioned, there's, in the last 6 months, there's a 12% increase in violent crime, which not only, that's not a one-car operation, that's a 2 to 3 person response. In addition, we have the state impact with our prison system, which they're going to release over 1,000 people into our county. That's the projection. So even though we're looking at ways as a public safety system, and we are lucky in this county to have a system that works together to try to achieve those results, it is going to be an impact, and we're trying to meet those with the current staffing levels, as you mentioned. Additionally, in the proposed final budget, there are an additional 4 grant positions that have been funded, but there's also 4 less vacant unfunded positions because of the court's reductions. So we're continuing to try to meet those obligations and reductions so there's no further impact on the county and the county general fund. One of the things that I wanted to point out is that, and Tom mentioned with the discussion with Robert, is that the county policies and goals, when feasible, are to have a net county cost of 0. That is an admirable goal to have. During my tenure here, we have not done that. Normally, we have used our fund balance carryover to help balance that budget and fund the cost for the next year. In the proposal that the CEO is presenting today, you would achieve a net county cost of 0. So our fund balance carryovers would be used for other purposes within the county, which is your board's prerogative to do. We agree with the reductions into the operational costs that have been submitted and appreciate the proposal to increase the general fund to help augment that. We are requesting that no further cuts be made and that the remainder of the $1,025,000 be that fund balance carryover, which is actually $200,000 less than the actual carryover that we've been able to attribute to the department. And those savings, there again with the policies that your board has adopted and trying to project the recommendations that we made at proposed budget is what helped to achieve that. Those again are the reduction in our beat around South Placer and Granite Bay, the reduction to our I-80 corridor, our reduction to our jail and professional staffing. Our 71% of our budget is staffing. We have made reductions over the last several years of $12 million to $10 million for our services supplies. That's getting pretty close to about 10%. The other costs that we have are inter-county charges for services to true up and make our budget, all our costs within our budget whole. So we will, as the board directs, and as Ed had mentioned, the sheriff, that whatever your board directs, we will accomplish that goal. But we are asking that we have already made significant reductions and cuts to our budget. We're asking to not take any further cuts, but whatever your board approves and the direction that you take, we will certainly find ways to make that happen. The other thing that was presented to you before is, well, that's easy. We'll just make these cuts and it'll be easy. We would ask that if you make those reductions to our budget, that as prescribed by law, that the sheriff has the ability to define how those reductions would be made, and that we don't have to identify specifically unfunded positions or changes in our services and supplies as we go through those the year, because those do shift and they move up and down. So in accordance with that flexibility, we would ask that that not be a criteria in that. The other thing that we would ask is, should the public safety sales tax or other revenues increase, that as we've submitted before, that we're able to come back to your board for additional review of those increases and what impact that may have either on current operational or future one-time expenditures, such as one of our priorities in-car cameras or our aging computer system, those types of things. So we appreciate there again your consideration. I know that there's been some options that have been put forth to you that we don't feel are feasible, and even though it may look easy, in reality, it's not. And we would ask your board's, review to allow that to be done in a manner that the sheriff feels best meets his operations. We're open for any questions that you may have.
Jim?
As far as the potential release of prisoners by the state,
Yes.
isn't that a burden that would be shared with the probation department? What kind of percentage would that be? Do you have any idea?
They're still working on it, but as I mentioned, that's a system-wide problem and a system-wide review that they're looking at those solutions. Becky, do you have more?
Yeah, I would like to add some comments to that. We have been doing quite a bit of studying that with probation right now and District Attorney's Office both. In fact, Scott Owens at the last Criminal Justice Policy Committee meeting offered to take a look at his projections that he had done earlier. At this point, I mean, crystal ball work, but at this point we are anticipating somewhere between 400 and 800 folks that would be coming back to us from the state actions, and we have already begun discussions about something we're calling a welcome center, where we would staff that with folks from Health and Human Services and our criminal justice agencies, and probably even some private nonprofit agencies would come in to make sure that the needs that those folks have as they transition back to us would be addressed. And we would help them to try to successfully transition back into our communities as best possible. We also know from the activities of probation recently that there is additional capacity in the jail. We do have beds available to us now, should some of those folks need those services. So and as I mentioned earlier, we have set aside funding for 4 additional probation officers next year that we will feather into the department as needed when those folks start showing back up in the county.
So the burden would be spread between all our departments?
Yes, it
Health and
would.
Human Services.
Yes, it would be spread across the entire justice system.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Now, can we charge the state for those? Nothing?
And it would
It
also...
sounds like we're opening up a visitor center.
Yes, that's the idea. But it's also, those costs would also be spread across Health and Human Services. I think at the Criminal Justice Policy Control Committee, is that Maureen brought to our attention that she was notified that there were 2 inmates being released from Folsom Prison 2 weeks ago that required psychiatric care.
Oh, wonderful.
And we were given a full day's notice of that, and Maureen was able to ascertain that one did not come from Placer County, so we had to triage around the one that needed, permanent bed space, something like that. So it is a burden that will come on us in many ways, yet even to be anticipated.
Any other questions? Any other comments? Thank you. Let's take a 5-minute break before we start on Health and Human Services.
Are you going to ask the DA probation?
Yeah, we can. Welcome back, everybody. We will continue with this uplifting presentation. I guess, Becky, are you going to continue?
Yes. If I could have some slides, please. There we go. Okay, to continue our final budget adjustment discussions, we'll now be turning to Health and Human Services. As we have briefed your board, the direct impact to Health and Human Services from the state budget action was a net reduction of $7 million. That is broken down into $5.6 million revenue impact from the state for specific program funding and an additional $1.4 million reduction in the realignment sales tax revenue that we have discussed already. And that is not reflective of the $5 million annual shortfall due to the state funding or failure to fund the cost at the consistently since 2001. We have discussed with your board the fact that the most significant impacts to the budget are hitting the Child Protective Services area and the areas that support foster care. And we anticipate that absent a restoration to their budget, that the department would experience up to a 50% increase in their social worker caseloads and would have difficulty meeting mandated 24-hour emergency response times. To do a quick review of HHS's budget since 2008-9, their final budget in 2008-9 was $160,141,000. At proposed budget, following the same model that I discussed with the sheriff's discussion, where we've loaded their cost of doing business increases, that caused increase at proposed budget to $166,629,000. With the revenue reductions I just described, that brings their recommended final budget down to $160,801,000. Similar comparison for their general fund contribution. You can see that it was in 2009 final, $30.9 million, and it proposed was $33.7, and with this recommended action would go to $34.2 million. And Dr. Burton and the directors are in the audience if you had any questions for them about these service impacts or what this restoration would help avoid. But other than that, we are ready for any questions you may have.
Any questions? Yes, Robert.
Not a question, but a comment, sort of getting one asked for, I guess. But the prior budget discussion we had, not yesterday, but before, I just simply asked that I think with all the departments, but specifically with HHS, in that it is getting hit so hard by the state. It's not that we want to hear the bad news, but I think it's important for us to continually get updates from the department as we go through the year as to the impacts on our levels of service. So one, that we know, and if there are any prospective adjustments that can be made, I think we need to know that, and I think it'll help us in our longer-term planning as we weave our way through this new world that we're in. So that's a request, I guess. Thanks.
Any other comments? Jennifer, did you start to do it?
Yeah. Sorry. I didn't push hard enough. If we could just get a very brief recap on what the additional contribution from the general fund will allow us to do in terms of increased service through HHS, I think that would be really useful for me. Obviously, my concern is the Tahoe services, because it is so far-flung from services which would continue to exist in the west end of the county. But if you could just recap that briefly with the emphasis on Tahoe, I would greatly appreciate that.
Okay. I might want to turn that over to Dr. Burton to
Okay,
discuss that.
that would be fabulous. Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Burton, the Director of Health and Human Services. Specifically, the restoration of the $1.1 million as being mentioned this morning will be focused on our Child Protective Services and offsetting the reduction that occurred in the state final budget, allowing the caseloads to be maintained at a workable level and providing safe and secure environments for the kids. Yesterday in the presentation, I mentioned about a $600,000 proportionate fiscal impact in the Tahoe area if we were going to apply all the reductions in the state budget proportionately out. With the uniqueness of Tahoe and the sites that are up there, there's no plan at this point to reduce any services in Tahoe. And with this $1.1 million, we'll be able to maintain the Child Protective Services in that area.
Any other questions? Oh, we got Doc up here. Good job. Turn it back over to you.
Well, if there are no further questions or discussion on the final budget adjustments, I think we'll turn the discussion back over to Jeff for some closing comments.
Give us a moment, we'll get back in just a minute.
You need a helper just to carry all your paperwork. At least we're keeping the logging industry in business, so all the paperwork floating around.
We have gifts. Yeah, some of this will be heading up. Yeah, thanks.
There you go.
Yeah, some of this will be heading up to the once. For the members.
Go ahead. And come out.
Two men and a small boy to carry all that. Thank you, Ann.
Mr. Chair and members, as the variety of adjustments head around to you right now, what we're heading into next are the summary adjustments, the adjustments by fund, and then the adjustment worksheets. The last items that just came to you was a rather large stack of summary worksheets, and that'll be the last component of items that we'll go through, but in the interest of time, what I've done is made sure they're handed out to you and available as we get to that section of the presentation. So we'll be coming to those in just a couple moments. In terms of the final budget adjustments, what I thought we could do now in terms of the presentation, though, is get to the portion of the presentation where we talk about where we've gone from in terms of the proposed budget to the final budget, and then we will go from final budget 0809 to what the final budget for 910 will look like. So from proposed to final, and then from final budget to final budget. As we look at proposed budget to final budget, and as we talked about earlier this morning, the general fund went from $361.9 million to, as we talked about earlier, $354.8, or $7.1 million in decline. What that looks like in terms of all the operating funds, you can see the $7.1 million change in the proposed final budget at the very top. That's the general fund. That's on this worksheet, in this blue and white worksheet, the 361.9, the 354.8, or the 2% additional reduction right there. What it means for the total operating budget is about a $6.4 million additional reduction, or an additional 1.2%. The total budget, however, went up by about 2.1% from proposed to final, from $769 million to $784. Now, that's proposed to final, okay? So it went up from proposed to final, but that's only when comparing the proposed 910 to the final 910. That's not our year-over-year comparison. That's just comparing the proposed 910 to the final 910. As we look at what's happening year over year, when we compare our year-over-year budget, we're still going down considerably. As a matter of fact, that budget is still going down $80.4 million. Operating budget, $22.6 million. Capital road budget still down $57.8, for a total of $80.4. And that breaks out, again, in our comparison of the final budget of 0809 to our proposed, or recommended, if you will, final budget for 910. You can see a $22 million general fund change, or a 5.8% reduction year over year, or at grand total of an $80.4 million that we just saw a moment ago difference, which totals at a 9.3% year-over-year decline. So year-over-year, our budget is declining 9.3%. Any questions?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Kurt?
If I could ask you, so you and I are on the same page literally, would you open your proposed budget there that's in front of you to page 19? Because you're giving us some new numbers here that I want to work from, but I want to make sure I'm working from a consistent basis here. And on page 19,
Okay.
under the salaries and benefits line, you see a line of $277,734,000 right there at the top, right?
Right.
Okay.
Okay, I'm with you.
Do you know what that line, is that roughly the same in the recommended final, or would that have changed from this proposed to the recommended final? All in salaries and benefits. And the reason I'm asking the question is because yesterday's slide, number 12, which is the salaries and benefits all funds, has a couple of different numbers, one of about $260 million, which is a little bit less than what this is showing.
Yeah, it should have gone down, because we were doing we were proposing to reduce salaries and benefits with
So the
fund position.
$260 million is the number that is being proposed as a part of the recommended final for 910. 259-ish. And that was on slide 12 of yesterday. I'm just trying to get an apples to apples of what was in our proposed budget versus what we're proposing for final.
Let me get that exact number for you. I don't have that in front of me right here for salaries and benefits, but it'll be less because we were proposing to reduce the amount of salaries and benefits.
Okay. So I guess all I'm asking you to confirm is if what is reflected on slide 12 from yesterday, I don't know if any of you have a hard copy of that, if what's reflected on slide 12 from yesterday would be the number that you would plug in right there under salaries and benefits at the 260.
Okay, slide 12.
259.
Okay. If you mind, let me
problem.
come back to
Go
it.
ahead.
Okay. Okay.
So you've got two different lines tracking on slide 12. You've got adjusted salaries and benefits, and then you have salaries and benefits without OPEB, and I was a little curious as to how that one was higher, reflected higher.
The slide on slide, thank you very much. Slide 12 at that you're seeing there, that is actually what we were projecting it would be. So that number is a projected amount that we think it would be based on our estimate at the time. The number that you'll see in the budget will probably be a little higher than this because it'll be budgeted. This is what we were projecting that the figure will actually be based on looking at what 8-9 actuals were.
Okay.
So what you'll see in the budget will probably actually be a little higher than this figure, actually.
Okay, so I'm just looking for a number with which to work today.
Okay.
So do we have a guesstimate as to which of these numbers? I'm guessing it's a little less than the 277 in our proposed.
I'll get it for you.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to clarify, in case some of the others are lost in the conversation, is it, when we have a budget, the budget is what we expect to expend. Some expenses go up, some go down. At the end of the year, you have a fund balance, hopefully, that shows that you did not spend all your budgeted dollars, and your revenues at least stayed where you would hope and did not decline, and that creates a fund balance, and that's why you have a budgeted amount. But every year, we also track actual expenditures as they occurred and actual revenues they occurred. So the actuals are always different than the budgeted amounts. Sure. And I think that's part of it.
But I think what I'm hearing is that, yes, it's different, but when you're talking about $250 million in the category, we're maybe $10 million different there, so percentage-wise, it's not astronomical.
It's not, and it would be less than, I don't think it'd even be that great of a difference, actually, Supervisor Euler.
So just kind of stepping back the comment that was made by our chairman earlier as he was asking about the plan going forward and how we look at where we are today and how we can look ourselves, our employees, and our constituents in the face and say that we do have a plan going forward, and we are, unlike folks about 40 miles down Interstate 80, we are actually taking steps to address fundamental structural deficiencies. We have to look at the primary cost drivers. Obviously, we spent a lot of time talking about the revenue side. The downside to spending the time focusing on the revenue side is a whole bunch more theoretical than our cost drivers. Our cost drivers, largely driven by contracts, are more tangible. We know what they've been. Now, obviously, we have some contracts that are up right now or expiring soon, and so we don't want to know what the result of those negotiations would be. But when you look at, and it's tying a number of different slides together, when you look at slides from today, slide 10, which shows that the period going from 2005-06 to 2009-10, we've seen a 0.3% increase in our revenue growth, our general fund revenue growth over those 4 years. A 0.3%. Yes, we had some spikes up, but then a dramatic spike back down. So averaged out, you're looking at a 0.3% from $314 million, almost $315 million, to $316 million. During that same time, the single largest cost driver that we have, which is our salaries and benefits line, which is approximately 52% of our budget, a little over half of our budget, when you take out capital improvements, which is important to note. Got to take out capital improvements in order for this to be a fair comparison. That the average cost per funded and filled position, at the same time that our revenue increased 0.3%, the average cost per funded and filled position increased 16.4% during that same 4-year period. So when you have something that makes up over half of your expenditures increase 16.4% at a time when your revenues only increased 0.3%, you don't have to go very much farther to figure out structurally why we are where we are. And so kind of, I guess, hearkening back to the opening of yesterday's meeting and the discussion about not only right sizing, but figuring out how we go forward, deliver services that our constituents pay for and have come to expect, we are going to have to look at that single biggest cost driver and manage it down. That's all.
You guys are-
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Hinton.
You got that?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Could you go get Barbara's easy button?
Yes, I'll grab that.
I mean, I think Supervisor Yoder just made an outstanding point, an observation that really, moving forward, we have to come up with a better way of doing business. I mean, we cannot continue, if it's going up 16 and our monies are only going up 0.3, I don't think we're ever going to have a cash infusion like we've had in the last decade, so to speak, before this thing hit. So, it can probably be painful. It's not going to be fun, but we're going to have to do what we're going to have to do. Thank you. Jennifer.
To quote Monty Python now for something completely different, if we could go to just county operating funds number 104, community revitalization, that's a huge increase that we're looking at year over year. Could you briefly explain why we're seeing a 1,068% increase in that fund?
Yeah, there's a couple things that happened in that fund.
I figured.
There were. At proposed budget, there was a timing issue because that is a fund that normally you would have seen the funds that are associated with it. It typically would have been about a $2 million grant fund, but the timing sequence of it was such in 08-09 that it didn't get its grant funding, its normal grant funding, in time for the 08-09 budget. So it was lower, to the tune of about $460,000. So half of it came in at proposed budget and was a restoration. Then additionally, and we'll come back to it again here when we come into the adjustment sheet. You'll see there was a revenue increase from a CDBG grant for an additional $1.9 million. So there's considerably additional grant funding coming into that Fund 104.
Great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. And thank you for that segue, actually, Supervisor Montgomery, because as we're heading, are there additional questions on the proposed final budget adjustment worksheet?
I don't see any.
Okay. If there are none, the next section is the final budget adjustment worksheets, which were just handed out. There are 3 sections. The first, hopefully, that you have is the thickest one. It's the general fund one. It says it up in the left-hand corner, should say general fund on it. The first few pages, there are 4 pages, and what I'd like to do is just use those 4 summary pages. Behind them are the detailed final budget adjustment worksheets. What I'd like to do is just briefly highlight some of the main points on the summary adjustment, the highlight pages in those first 4 pages. And then if you had questions, we could go back to the adjustment sheets. But highlight some of the main points on each of those 4 pages, give you some time. If you have any questions on them, these are the adjustments that would be proposed, going from the proposed to the final budget in the general fund. Then we would move to other operating funds, as Supervisor Montgomery had just noted, for example, in Fund 104. And then there's the third one, which is the internal service funds and enterprise funds. So starting with the general fund, obviously the appropriation for contingencies has revenues decreases of $16.8 million. The largest, of course, is what we've talked about for some time now, the Prop 1A adjustment. Some additional adjustments there to property taxes at $2.7 million, sales tax adjustments totaling $16.8 million. The other large adjustment on that first sheet, you can see we've had significant adjustments at the bottom of the page there. Planning and biomass grants, $874,000. Turning to page 2, you can see the clerk recorder, and I had alluded to this at the beginning this morning. The clerk recorder had significant revenue increases of about $1.4 million. Also, about almost at the bottom of the page there, towards about the bottom third of the page, it talked about the emergency services grants. I think we talked about those some yesterday, the Homeland Security grants, increased revenues. This is where you see those on appropriation number 22310. That's on page 2 of 4. Also, at the very bottom of the page, there's another $500,000 in child support services, increased federal and state revenues. On page 3, you will see a series of Health and Human Services changes. And this is where you see all those changes to Health and Human Services that have happened from the state. There's a whole series of them that start basically from about the third of the page on down. And this is where you'll see the series of reductions and adjustments associated with the state. And these are all the appropriations that affects. And those continue on to page 4. Any questions on the general fund?
Kirk?
Mr. Chairman, just to be clear, today we are not looking for board action on these. This is simply reviewing where we are as of today. You'll come back for final adoption of our budget, I believe, in September. Is that correct?
Right.
Isn't the direction to prepare the final budget based upon these, but your actual adoption would be on hopefully September 8th, and the public hearing would commence on that, but these numbers would roll into that final document.
Just based on how it was agendized, and I defer to Tony, I think the way it was agendized was you guys were going to show up and present what you have to present. If we had any suggested revisions, we're to let you know. Otherwise, you're just going to move forward with what you've presented for action.
I see a lot of heads going.
Yes.
For action in the future.
Yes, the budget has to be adopted at a notice public hearing.
Right.
The purpose and the historical purpose of the workshop really hasn't changed. The format changes a little bit. It gives the final board direction as to what they expect to see proposed at that public workshop.
Right.
The rules get very complicated about changes that occur during or after the workshop, but before the workshop and the public hearing, the board can give direction here, and I'm sure that the CEO would carry that direction out.
I guess I want to make sure that I'm not misunderstanding that whether we are supposed to act today or, I remember previous board workshops that essentially resulted in budget-by-budget motions to approve on a budget-by-budget basis back years ago.
And always that has been direction. In some years, particularly if there's disagreement among the board on direction, it is helpful to have a motion for staff to be clear as what the motion direction is on a particular line item. But at this point, you're giving direction to bring this thing back on September 8th, I guess we're going to.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. I just wanted to make sure staff was getting from us what they needed today, that's all.
Did you have a comment?
No, got it. It's great.
Jennifer?
I had two questions. One, in terms of the animal control, 22,390. Increased expense for a one-time washer dryer, $14,000. Is that some super special washer dryer? It must be.
The cat's coming there a little dirty.
It is a commercial grade washer dryer, and it is, yes, indeed.
For cleaning rags and stuff like that, right?
Blankets.
Blankets, okay.
Yes, indeed.
Good. You don't want it to be cleaning some of the things my compatriots here have been suggesting. And then in the CEO 10070, I'd just like a clarification on the reduction to the TRPA services. What services are those?
Which page is that on?
Page 2 of 4.
For one,
And I just, looking at the detail, I don't really see that on here.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, just a second. I had it.
I still don't see it.
Detail from
I'm looking at sub-fund,
Oh, you're looking in the back.
yeah.
I'm getting there. Where is it?
Oh, there it is. Correction to 2555, it says, TRPA.
Oh, that's right. It was, I think it was moved from one area to another. It was like a technical adjustment, so it was, the 100,000 is added to 2555, and it's reduced on
Okay.
some other place. I can't find it.
Correction. Was it corrections?
It appears to be a correction as opposed to an adjustment. I don't think, we did not reduce any contributions
So it was
to
just
TR.
taken out of one fund and put in another, in other words. Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. We'll go to other operating funds.
Right, moving to other operating funds. We had discussed Fund 104. That was the adjustment that you noticed there. First, the larger adjustment of $2.4 million, $2.6 million. Fund 110 had a decrease in general fund contribution and an increase in expenditures for contingencies to the tune of $2.8 million. Open Space Fund, this is where you see the revenue decrease for the general fund contribution that we had discussed earlier. That's in Fund 150. Turning to page 2, you can see the major adjustments in capital projects of about $4 million. There's a rebudget for ongoing capital projects with a net revenue decrease of 4.1 due to account timing of project constructions and receipt of project revenues in prior years. In Fund 120, down about a third from the bottom, you can see the major adjustments there. Rebudget of about $17.2 million for road project expenses and offsetting federal, state, and other project revenues. And then you can see the adjustments in road maintenance of about $1.3 million for heavy equipment and offsetting federal and reimbursement revenues. And then in Fund 110, you can see the decreased grant revenues of $2.6 million, offsetting public safety sales tax revenue and other revenues of $338,000. Are there any questions on other operating funds?
Jennifer, did you still,
Did I leave my light on? I'm sorry.
any questions? See none.
Okay. And finally, turning to internal service funds. On this sheet, you can see Fund 250 at the top, revenue increase of about $930,000, rebudget of about $1 million in revenue and expense for Iowa Hill. This is what Clark had talked about during his presentation. Moving down a little further, you can see the reduced revenue in Fund 270 to reflect charge reductions from fund balance savings.
And
In general-
just to interrupt for a minute, that
Sure.
$1 million for Iowa Hill is reflective of a state or federal grant. Right.
Right. Sorry. Turning to page 2, Public Works Transit, you can see large adjustments there, about $6.5 million. 5.9 of that is a rebudget of equipment, buses, farebox systems with supporting federal revenue, rebudget. Another $1.8 million for CNG project with offsetting revenue. $860,000 for rebudget of heavy equipment in Fund 210. And fleet operations, about $130,000. Adjustment in revenue, a rebudget of $188,000 in equipment with partially offsetting revenue of $130,000. Are there any questions for internal service funds and enterprise funds?
See none.
Okay. Then, Mr. Chair and members, and then to kind of revisit what was just stated, we will take the changes as proposed and return to your board for a public hearing on September 8th with the proposed changes and the guidance you have provided us.
Okay. Any comments?
Earlier, Teresa had told us about in about 90 days, the state's going to come back at us. How are we going to handle that? I don't know how to ask that question. I'm afraid to ask that question. But
That's an easy one.
it is?
Yeah, we're going to come back to your board, and you'll make wise decisions and provide clear guidance. I mean, it's very difficult to anticipate what the state will do. Your board also, earlier this year, which we will continue to do, is essentially freeze $10 to $15 million in potential capital expenditures. Not that that would be our recommendation to cannibalize those, but we still have reserves, we still have contingencies. We will come forward with hopefully prudent recommendations to whatever the state does to do the least harm to the citizens that we serve, and your board also always provides us clear guidance on how to accomplish that. So that's all we can do.
Okay.
Robert?
Just some brief comments, I guess, to finish up. First, I want to thank staff over all these years for the tremendous work done working on such detail. The numbers are numbers, but really they reflect the philosophy behind the organization, and I guess I'm just really pleased to see all the departments and the camaraderie and the effort that was put forth to try to make all of this work on behalf of the people for whom we work. I guess I've been here long enough to be pretty much to have experienced pretty much the best and the worst at times Placer County fiscally. And I guess as we go forward, the kind of economy we had just a few years ago, I don't think will return. And just as a flavor of that, not that I'm an expert or anybody is in economics, one of the major developers that is a big player in our neck of the woods nationally had recently 30,000 employees. Now they have 5. There are several of those people that I know who were making $200,000 salaries and now are unemployed. One of them took a cut in pay to take another job. Their cut is more than the Board of Supervisors makes, including benefits.
Benefits. Do you get benefits?
But I think structurally some things that might be more telltale are that it used to be in recent history, last 20 years, that Placer County's unemployment rate outperformed the nation and the state and the Sacramento region. Recently, last year and a half, it's doubled. And that's not the case anymore. That disparity is gone. So I'm optimistic. I think things will get better, but I don't think they'll come back to the world that we used to live in. And we have to plan for that, and I think we have done a really good job. I think the key is to make it through the next few years, keeping in mind our perspective on the general fund contributions that we have, and the fact that we've used about a quarter of our contingency reserves thus far in this economy, and we have to make it through the rest of this economy before we can start planning more healthy. I'm worried about the state. Dr. Burton said eloquently yesterday, really described how it's during times like this that we actually, if all was perfect, we could shift actually more resources to Health and Human Services and public protection. But the state, in fact, has hurt us most where we need the help. And we don't need help from them. We need them to leave us alone. But that's not the case. It's probably not going to be the case. I don't think the budget that they currently have is actually going to last very long. So we are going to be having to deal with all of that. And with all of that, I think Kirk really hit the nail on the head recently in his comments as it relates. Essentially, we're in the service business, and with that, what we do mostly is provide payroll and salaries and benefits. And it's we've been able to enjoy the ability to attract incredibly competent people. That's reflected in the level of operation of the county, but we have to look at that differently. The good news is that inflation looks like it's going to be slow, so we don't have to compensate with high increases in the cost of payroll to cover inflation, hopefully, at least for the short run. But we have to think through that modeling differently, and it has to be reflected in the way we do business. I think the board has done a good job of biting the bullet and dealing with fee increases where they're appropriate. That's how we got a lot of the money for our facilities enhancements over the last 10, 15 years. So lastly, I'll just say that as we've built new roads and buildings, I think it's reflected in these numbers, but I am concerned it's sometimes easy to defer maintenance. On roads, for example, if you don't take care of them for a few years, people don't notice that much, but then you get to a point where you really can't even recover the cost of maintaining those roads. And the same with our buildings. We have some nice new facilities that our employees need, that the citizens need for better service. And so I think we structurally want to keep an eye on that budget in terms of long-term revenues versus long-term expenses, and make sure that we provide the best levels of service we can on an ongoing basis.
Jennifer.
I would just like to echo the sentiments up here that this has been a really fantastic presentation, and thank staff and just really give you all a round of applause, because what you do allows us to do what we do, for better or worse. And I also want to encourage everyone, all of us in here, all the employees at all levels, to continue thinking about ways we can save costs, because even very small savings add up. And I've had a number of employees come to me with some really good suggestions that I'm going to forward to CEO's office, and just look at small changes that cumulatively create some large savings for the county. And a lot of what we've been able to rein in and pull back on have come from suggestions from the rank and file, from the folks in this room. And without that continued input and a good continued working relationships between the union and the non-union staff, we're going to have a much harder road to hoe if we don't continue to value those relationships and work with each other. So just, again, thank you all, and anyone who's watching on DVD or online, continue with those suggestions. Bring them in, because they all help. Thank you.
I just conclude, thank you. Thanks, staff, also for the fine job. Mention that Pulte and Centex merged this morning, or they got the approval to merge, which will form, I guess, the largest home builder now in the nation. With me, I don't know how many employees they're going to have, but they're going to do that. But we've got our challenges ahead of us, but I think we're up to doing it. I just hope that we'll continue to try to cut costs. We'll do what we have to do, continue to provide services, to the best of our ability. But I'm not envious of what we're faced with for the next several years. So, but thank you all for the hard work that you do. You really do the heavy lifting. Really, the decision making, although it's hard, I don't think has we don't have to put out the same effort. Anyway, thank you. I guess we're adjourned, isn't it? Closed session?
You don't have a closed session. So there will not be any closed session today.
So we are adjourned.
I know, but Tom doesn't. Yeah, nothing.